whenever people say something and present it as black or white, where there's only one possible view, I think that is problematic. So there will be people who write statements like, diversity always leads to better performance, period. Sometimes you have so much diversity in an organization that people speak different languages and it's sort of hard to get consensus. So clearly, yes, we do want organizations to be more than just white men, but to claim, well, this is always better in every situation, I think when you make the statement more sweeping, I think this could be problematic.
Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jen Wilson. This is a podcast where we talk about prioritizing people, planet, and profit. In each episode, we speak with world-leading experts who help us see the future we want and our role in it. This is episode 16, Nuance and ESG. Quick story. I've been listening to some of my favorite episodes from the Future in Sound, and there are a couple practitioners and experts that really stand out. Now, you'd think that they'd be really impressive for their credentials in sustainability and their deep knowledge, and of course, that's a really big part of it. But what really stood out to me was their human capabilities, their ability to look beyond their own points of view, to connect with others and to form a unifying approach forward. More specifically, Amory Levins talked a lot about not just the hard data and analysis related to energy efficiency and moving to renewables, but he talked about how he's really motivation agnostic, how he'll work with people from all different backgrounds, whether they're in the petroleum industry or wherever they're coming from, as long as they're looking to reduce carbon. He's willing to roll up his sleeves and work with them. Or Gillian Tett from the Financial Times, who talked about anthrovision, or her thoughts on how to best take a look at one's blind spots to better understand how to move forward in the sphere of ESG. I mean, these people really, show that to get to the highest level of performance and sustainability, it's really about thinking through how we connect with others, how we hear each other, and how we move forward in seemingly divisive debates. The reason I bring up this story today is because the guest on the podcast is extraordinary at being able to stand in different positions and help us think through how we move forward. You might not agree with everything that he has to say, or you might. The point is, he's really good at thinking through the mindset that's required in order to take tough decisions when trade-offs exist, and I'm absolutely delighted to have him on the show today. Alex has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, presented to the World Bank Board of Directors, and has also spoken through the TEDx and TED Talk system twice. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, has been interviewed by Bloomberg, BBC, CNBC, CNN, the list goes on. Impressively, he's also received many teaching awards. So at Wharton, he received 14 teaching awards, and he's also won Best Teacher awards for his MBA and Masters in Financial Analysis programs at the London Business School. So Alex, welcome to the Future in Sound.
Thank you, Jen. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I wanted to start with your journey and how you think. So obviously, you've both worked in academia and you've spent time as an investment banker. I'm wondering, as you think about how your research ideas and how your work really germinates, where does it come from? Does it come from both the practitioner and the academic lenses, or where did this interest start?
It indeed does come from both. I think it's very important to have both the practitioner insight, but also the academic rigor. So what did my time at Morgan Stanley teach me? It taught me the importance of real-world factors. And without that, I think the research that you could conduct could be purely theoretical. So there is an accusation of research being ivory tower, and I don't think that accusation is unfair. In many cases, it can be that research is conducted without knowledge of the issues. And this is particularly the problem in the issue that I'm sure we're going to talk about today, which is purpose and ESG, is that there's many professors who are just jumping on the bandwagon and starting to write about ESG because it's a hot topic without actually knowing what these issues involve. And this is very dangerous because those papers can get published in the top academic journals. Why? Because the editors of those journals don't have knowledge of these issues, but they know we should publish something because we know this is hot. And then once something gets published, even if it's wrong, then other people will write other papers using the same methodology because they say, well, this was used in this early paper. So I think it is really important to have the understanding of the real world because that will then align and be relevant to the research. So let me just give a specific example. So how did my time at Morgan Stanley shape the research that I do? Well, at Morgan Stanley, you have a huge amount of extrinsic incentives, right? So if you work hard, you can get a bonus, you can get promoted and more money and so on. But despite this being an organization where there were so strong extrinsic motives, what I realized was the human factor was really important. So how well you were treated, if your boss went to a meeting and gave you a call on the way back debriefing you to tell you how the meeting went, that made a huge impact. And so when I started my PhD at MIT, I thought, well, let me look into the importance of the human factor in the organization. And this was way before ESG became so popular. And this was not me responding to something being hot and in vogue, but me just realizing that these human factors matter and that I wouldn't have got had I not worked those times in Morgan Stanley in London and New York.
Got it. And so you started very early on being interested in the human factors. And you've written this book, Grow the Pie. I'd love to hear a little bit about, how you summarize the main premises of the book for our audience, and also where those ideas started to germinate before you wrote the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you a little bit of the synopsis and then tell you what motivated it and where the ideas spring from. So let me explain, well, what is the pie to begin with? The pie is the amount of value that a company creates. And you can divide that pie between investors in the form of profits and society in the form of wages to workers, taxes to the government, and fair prices to customers. And often people have a fixed pie mentality. So if the pie is fixed, as a CEO, the only way you can make more money is by paying less to your workers, charging more to your customers, and so on. And I'm sure many of us will be able to think of companies, I'm not going to name names, but we might think of companies that we think of as being exploitative. That's how they make money. But I thought, well, there's a different way to run business, and this is what I call the pie growing mindset. If you're a company that delivers value to your stakeholders, for example, investing in your employees, you're not just being charitable, you're not just giving pie to them. The employees are becoming more motivated and more productive and more likely to stay, and this ultimately leads to a more successful and profitable company. And then you might think, well, where did the idea come from, Jen? Well, again, from my experience of the real world, because you often think, well, what is the way that you satisfy your employees? You pay them more. Right? If you look at the news, there's all these disputes about pay. But what I thought of Morgan Stanley is we were really, really well paid as junior analysts, but still people were really unhappy. And so what made a difference between the happy analysts and the ones who were not? It would be the smaller thing. So if you had a boss who would call you and say, the analysis that you spent your weekend working on, this came up in the meeting and the client was really impressed by how much we understood that issue. And so I thought, well, there are possibilities of win-wins where everybody can be better off. And so let me write about that. And you might have thought, well, okay, if that was the genesis of ideas, why now? Why don't I choose to write it in 2020? It's because of this debate that we have between business and society. So there are some business leaders who try to really squeeze as much out as possible for society. But on the other hand, you have some business reformers who argue that the only way to make society better is to straitjacket business and to over-regulate them. And I think that there are ways of actually helping both communities, and those ways have been seen by me as a junior banker at Morgan Stanley. Then they have been backed up by the research that I started during my PhD and carried on afterwards. And I thought now was the time, in so much polarization and antagonism between business and society, to try to write a book suggesting a more harmonious way of working.
It's a really exciting book, and I'm looking forward to digging into it a bit more deeply. Off the top of this interview, Alex, you talked a little bit about some researchers jumping on the bandwagon for ESG. And I'd love to hear a little bit from you on, what are some of the topics or the areas of research that our listeners should watch out for, where there are questions that aren't really being answered that well, and that, you would recommend that we're careful on assertions that are backed up.
Thanks very much, Jen. I'd say rather than talking about specific topics, I'll talk about general sort of telltale signs that something might be flimsy. And I think one of them is whenever people say something and present it as black or white, where there's only one possible view, I think that is problematic. So there will be people who write statements like diversity always leads to better performance, period. Now, I'm an ethnic minority, so I would love to believe that is true, but the whole point of diversity is you should be able to encourage a diversity of viewpoint. So just to say period, that sort of said there's only one possible view. And with diversity, there might be some aspects of diversity which are positive and some which are negative, and maybe diversity works up to a point. Sometimes you have so much diversity in an organization that people speak different languages and it's sort of hard to get consensus. So clearly, yes, we do want organizations to be more than just white men, but to claim, well, this is always better in every situation, I think when you make the statement more sweeping, I think this could be problematic. Similarly, if you make bold claims about something, then it probably is too good to be true. So there was a study which came out recently saying a $4 trillion ESG dividend, which argued that if companies just became more ESG friendly, $4 trillion would fall out of the sky. Well, again, this is sort of too good to be true, because if it was that you could so easily improve your performance by being more ESG friendly, then any company that wasn't ESG friendly, you should just go out of business because you're not getting these dividends. So whenever you have a claim which is extreme, I think that we should be wary of this. And this is linked to the idea of confirmation bias. So you kindly mentioned my TED Talks. My most viewed one is called What to Trust in a Post-Truth World. And that's the idea that if we would like to believe something is true, then we need to be particularly careful of it, because we might be lapping it up based on the conclusion, not the methodology. So for an ethnic minority like me, I would love to believe a study which says diverse teams always perform better, or companies with professionals on the board always perform better. But when I know that I would like to believe a result, then that would mean that I should be particularly discerning of whether the actual study was accurate.
That's really helpful. And so digging further into this idea of nuance when it comes to the business case for ESG, on this podcast, we've been talking about greenwashing for about a year. And I think what we're seeing as ESG becomes more and more mainstream is that we're seeing polarization on both sides. On one side, it's, greenwashing, we're not going far enough. And then on the other side, we're maybe going too far. Some states in the United States saying, okay, we can't have a divestment in energy stocks, or claiming that a focus on ESG is somehow undermining fiduciary duty. So again, as you say, this black and white thinking. And I'm wondering, Alex, from your perspective, what are some of the most important areas to apply nuance when it comes to the business case for ESG?
I think virtually every area you should be applying nuance, because it's very rare, particularly in social sciences, that things are black or white. Well, in physical sciences, we could say, okay, oxygen has a higher atomic mass than hydrogen. That's something that you could prove. But it's really difficult to prove that ESG always performs better, because to begin with, ESG comprises lots and lots and lots of different things. So the idea that every single ESG factor performs better is probably not going to be true. So I think as a business leader, the important is to recognize that there will be two sides to every story. And so while I don't agree with some of the tone with which the ESG challenges have been made, I do want to ask, well, some of these things could actually be right. Right, so your reaction when you see, say, attacks on ESG is to be defensive and to claim these people are just lobbied by the fossil fuel industry. But before arguing why they're wrong, first ask, well, might they actually be right? And when Tarek Bansi came up with his critique of ESG, I actually wrote a response to this, also a medium called "Is Sustainable Investing Really a Dangerous Placebo?" And I actually acknowledged some of his comments were correct. Right, I didn't agree with many of them, but some I would concede were right. And so to the specific question that you're asking, Jennifer, as to whether ESG investing conflicts with fiduciary duty, is to say, in many cases it won't, because many things that you do to help society also are good for investors, like investing in employees. But there might be other things which are not consistent with fiduciary duty. So if a company was to donate loads of its profits to charity, well, that's not clearly going to increase its returns to investors down the line. So to claim that every single thing that you can do to help society always pays off, that is not consistent with the evidence. There will be certain ESG factors that are win-wins, but others that are not. And so the key for a business leader is to understand which are the win-wins and which are the ones where actually it will be at the expense of shareholder value. And notice, even if something is at the expense of shareholder value, you might still pursue it, right? So if you're a company, I'm going to say, I'm going to decarbonize. This is actually not going to be good for my profits because I don't think there will be carbon taxes for the next 10 years. The government is just inert, but I'm going to do this anyway, even though there's no business case. And this might reduce my profits by 0.1%. That actually many shareholders would be happy with because they might think, well, we invest for retirement, and in retirement, we don't just care about our income, we'll care about if the planet 2 degrees warmer. So it may well be that as investors, you're willing to back a company that makes that sacrifice. I think where the problem of greenwashing happens is that if you're doing something for a social reason, but you also claim I'm going to make loads of money for it down the line, when you're not, that's when you're making too strong a claim. So if you're doing something for just the social good, just say it. Don't just say, oh, we're going to make loads of money from it as well. It may well be that there is a sacrifice, but as long as investors know that there's a sacrifice, they might be willing to support it.
I want to get a little bit deeper into this whole, like, how do we think beyond the win-wins and start to look at some of the nuance of the business case. But before we get there, on the topic of greenwashing, when it comes to policy and thinking through, well, how do we really regulate against this? We've seen some policies come to the fore in Europe, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or the sustainable disclosure requirements in the UK. And we're not going to get into a deep policy discussion here, but there are differences between the two. The EU regulation says, okay, if something's sustainable, it's sustainable in terms of its outcome. So it's green, it's renewable energy, therefore it's Article 9, which is the highest level of this regulation versus a lower level like Article 8 or Article 6. And when it comes to the UK policy, it's more, okay, well, if you buy as an investor a coal-fired power plant and then you drastically reduce its carbon emissions by turning to gas or renewables, then that counts as sustainable. And it strikes me that there's a bit of difficulty around how subjective sustainability is. And I'm just wondering, Alex, from your perspective, how do we think about regulating greenwashing or ensuring that what companies have to say is actually in line with what they're doing?
Yeah, so I think regulation is very difficult because regulation is implicitly black and white. Because when you regulate something, you have to say, well, what counts as sustainable and what doesn't count as sustainable? And you've just come up with some great examples, Jen. So is it sustainable to hold a coal-fired power station? It could be, right? Why? Because you're holding and you're engaging with it in order to reduce its carbon emissions. So I think the whole idea of regulation, just to say certain things count and others don't, I think this is problematic because there's many things which could be counted as sustainable. These are different shades of grey. So the listener might think, well, am I just copping out and saying, well, we can't regulate because we can't define it? I don't think this is so much of a cop-out as just being realistic, because notice that the problem of greenwashing applies to almost any investment product. So before ESG, you have value investing and you have growth investing. And so there's many funds which claim, we are value investors, we're going to find companies that are great value. And many of these value investing funds, they end up underperforming. So do we say, you're greenwashing because you claim to identify good value stocks and you lost money? For some reason, you can get away with that. You could be a value fund that loses money for your investors 5 years in a row. Nobody slams you in the media. Yet if you are a sustainable fund, and you happen to hold an energy company, even if that energy company is decarbonizing, you are slammed by the media and the regulator. So we recognize as regulators, how can we define whether a company is a value company or not? It's really difficult. Or a growth company, that's really difficult. And also we won't regulate, there are funds which say, I'm going to invest in frontier markets. How do we know what's a frontier market versus an emerging market versus a developed market? So I'm not sure whether this is something that a regulator can ever address. It's instead, I think, something that the ultimate responsibility has to fall to the consumers, the end users. So what does this involve is that if we are to buy a particular fund, well, look at what its holdings are. And if the holdings are something like oil and gas, then it may well say in the fund prospectus, well, our strategy is to buy these problematic companies and then turn them around. And you might think, well, what if we don't have the expertise or the time to do this? Well, this is why you have intermediaries like my broker, Hargreaves Lansdown in the UK. They will scrutinize different types of funds as well. So just as you don't have regulators which regulate, say, things like running shoes, right? You will look at them yourself and you might think, well, that's actually, if that's sort of at the same level as the fund, it may well be, because if you're running with the wrong shoe, you get seriously injured, and that could be something that could cripple you if you're a serious runner. So you would do research yourself, because there's not a standard which says this shoe is good and this shoe is bad. It just depends on what you want from a shoe. And similarly, this is going to be the same for investment funds. Yeah, certainly, if there are things which are just bad healthy, right, they are completely outlawed, and so this is why certain foods and drugs are completely banned by the US FDA. But you can have tobacco, it's still legal. You can have extremely sugary foods which are illegal, and so the fact that we are allowing those types of foods to be there, even though they can cause harm, this is because sort of the regulators think they still have a positive place in society. Certainly, you might have some funds which hold fossil fuel stocks, and they do satisfy certain people's definitions of sustainability. So I think just like we don't have this black and white thinking for other areas, value versus growth, or different types of food, I think when it comes to funds, it should be not so much left to regulators, but for companies to disclose information, disclose their portfolio holdings and their engagement, and then we as customers to make our own decisions, just like we will read the ingredients and the nutrition information on a label for some food.
Thank you for that great answer. Now, look, I really want to get into the trade-offs and how to apply the pie growing mindset. But before we do, some listeners might be asking the question, well, why, Alex, why, Jen, are we talking about this? Like, what are some of the, what's the best research on pie growing beyond just, bottom line, focusing on the bottom line as a company, or focusing on classic short-term returns as an investor? You've spoken in different forums about some really great longitudinal research on the value of ESG over time. Do you mind sharing with the audience some of the why? Like, why are we focusing on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just go into a little bit more detail in this study on the human factor, which I alluded to earlier. So what I wanted to look at was how companies that treat their workers better do in terms of financial returns. And you might think, well, why do we need to look at that? Isn't it obvious that companies that treat their workers better will do better? But it's not obvious, because treating your workers well is costly. And this is why you do have some companies who are accused of paying workers as little as possible. You might think, well, that's the best route to profit. So what I did, I took the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So that's a list which started in 1984. So why is that so important? Well, ESG, or purpose, or whatever you call it, that's a pretty new phenomenon. So many data sources have only been around, let's say, since 2010. And you might think, well, if I was to show you a study that worked between 2010 and 2019, you could say, well, those were 10 great years for the stock market. Maybe right now, in an inflationary environment, actually things are different. We need to just focus on the bottom line. So having a data source set that started in 1984 was really important because I had September 11th, the collapse of the internet bubble, the financial crisis, so I could make sure that this was something that held in bad times, not just good. And so long story short, I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% compound. So companies that were treating their workers better were doing better in terms of financial returns. And also I did further tests to suggest it's causation from treating your workers well to doing better, not the opposite, which is once the company is already doing well, then it can invest in its employees. And also I had to rule out third variables affecting both. So what is a third variable? Well, maybe if you're in the tech industry, employees are happy because the work's more innovative. And if you're in the tech industry, financial performance is good because the industry's happen to do well. So I had to remove all of the aspects, all of the parts of those third variables as well. And so that's just one of many studies that I cover in the book, but I thought, let me just go into a deep dive into one so that the listeners can look at sort of the rigor that a study needs to go through, in particular, ruling out alternative explanations before you can be published in a top academic journal.
Got it. And so that's an example of the kind of value that some of these non-financial factors can really have and deliver over time for business. Let's get into this issue of trade-offs or opportunity of trade-offs, applying the pie growing mindset. So we're going to go through two different examples, one for investors and the other for companies. So why don't we start with companies? So having read some of the headlines on BP, so in 2020, BP said, we're going to cut production by 40% by 2020. Obviously, really seeing a ton of pressure from stakeholders, but then also being aware of the transition that we're making in terms of climate policy. And then recently they reforecasted or recommitted to a lower reduction in production. So just 25% reduction in production by 2030 instead. And I'm just wondering, if we look at, this is a large organization, they're taking a look at a variety of different material issues and they're trying to come up with, what's the path forward? They talked about Ukraine, they talked about, affordable energy, etc. Applying the pie growing mindset, Alex, if you were, say, on the board, or if you were, say, speaking with an executive committee for BP or any oil and gas major, I just use them as an example. How could they apply some of the principles from Grow the Pie in order to make some of these trade-offs?
So I think one of the important parts of Grow the Pie is to realize that there's many, many different stakeholders. So who has slices of the pie? There's shareholders, there's the environment, but there's also customers, communities, government, and so on. So there's many people, not just the environment. So the environment absolutely matters. I passionately believe that climate change is a really, really important threat. But let me just stand in BP's corner for a moment. I'm not saying that they actually got the decision right? Whenever you do a U-turn, you are skeptical about the motives for it. But let me just temporarily stand in the corner is we have seen the world change. So a personal company does need to act and keep pace with changing circumstances. And we have seen Ukraine, and we have seen the effect of energy prices. And with energy prices, this can mean that people can't eat at home. It sometimes means businesses go out of business. I've known academic departments are ones which have to shut down. So actually, our nanny it came to the UK in order to do a master's in medical ethics, and the department that she's hoping to study in, that may well actually shut down. So somebody's education could be affected by energy prices. So these are things which have a larger societal impact. And so, yes, we absolutely do care a lot about decarbonisation, but the world right now does not have enough renewable energy sources in order to satisfy all of the goals out there. and then all of the energy needs out there. And so is there a case for cutting production less now than a couple of years ago? And the answer probably is going to be yes, given what we've seen with the Ukraine and the effect that high energy prices have had on people. Now, is this enough to go from 40 to 25%? I don't know that specific calculation without actually looking at the numbers. But the idea that any company that changes its goals is automatically hypocritical, I wouldn't agree with, because circumstances change, and so sometimes goals do need to change to keep up with. And I think this is why the whole idea of an investor-led, of investors always leading the way on these societal issues is problematic, because one accusation is investors are the 1%. Like, who gets to invest money with BlackRocks and Vanguard and State Street? It's the wealthy people. So do they care so much that energy prices are going up and perhaps causing less wealthy people to have to live in really cold conditions? Probably not, because they can still afford the energy prices. Do they care about a 50-year-old worker in a power station being out of their job through rapid decarbonisation? Maybe not. So do they care about the educational consequences of certain departments being shut down? Again, this might not be something they have to grapple with. So this is why I've always thought that government action is something which is really important. There's a limit to what you can achieve with investors. Investors don't represent all of wider society. And then when there are big traders with profit, we might be actually asking too much or expecting too much of investors when there's a large profit sacrifice that needs to be made. This is where something like a carbon tax, which a lot of economists call for, may well be the most optimal solution.
So it sounds like the profit trade-off and also the social cost was too great. And, you're able to stand in, BP's shoes and take a look at, why that trade-off was made rather than a knee-jerk reaction to why it was wrong.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that the final decision was definitely right, but I'm saying that we can't automatically claim it's wrong, because there are trade-offs. Yes, we absolutely do care about global warming. It's a very, very serious threat. But we also, people do need energy, particularly developing countries need it in order to develop. And there are many people who are employed by this industry, and the effect of unemployment on these people's families and children, that could be a chronic effect. You could have generations of people who end up being hit economically because their parents were out of work and were unable to easily retrain.
Sticking with this example, if you were on the board for a series of years and, obviously circumstances change, I'm guessing that part of this mindset would also be looking at how circumstances are changing, how technology is changing, and reevaluating the position as well. That's a sense that I'm getting from you, Alex. Is that right?
That is, and so then how did I putting my practitioner hat on this? So one of my other jobs is Royal Asset Management. I've been on their Responsible Investment Advisory Committee for 7 years. And so we've always been very positive about the tech industry, because, well, what does the tech industry do? This provides empowerment, it provides access to information, it provides financial inclusion through online banking, it reduces the importance of physical resources if you can do many things online. But we've actually been much more skeptical about the tech sector in recent years when you see the possibility of misinformation, cyberbullying, Cambridge Analytica, and so on. So we have become more neutral as we've learned more about sort of the downside as well as the upside. So I think while obviously a purpose should never swing in the wind and sort of be changing from day to day, we do need to be adapting to the times and realizing that, yes, you can change your stance on certain issues. And so people who had a negative spin on the defense sector and then now said, actually, we do realize that defense is important in a well-functioning economy, given the need for Ukraine to defend themselves. Yes, that they were doing a U-turn, but another way of saying a U-turn is that they were responding to new information. And I think that is better than just sticking with old beliefs and not changing them.
Thank you. And so one of the things that RICO does quite a bit is we work with private market investors who are holding companies between 5 and 7 years. And one of the things that we're often asked is, what time horizon for return on investment when it comes to ESG. And I'm just wondering, again, I know there's no right answer, but if we put the pie growing mindset kind of cap on, how would you suggest thinking through, well, what's the right ROI on investment in, say, carbon reduction or even in diversity, just, upskilling our entire team on how to hire more diverse candidates? How do you think about that, Alex?
Yeah, so many of these things, the payoff might not be for 5 years or more. So when I looked at my employee satisfaction study, there, even though it's public information, whether you're the best companies to work for list, and therefore you would think that in an efficient market, the stock price should immediately react. The real world, the markets are not efficient. And so what I found was that they didn't take just 5 months, it was 5 years before the effects of employee satisfaction was fully impounded into the stock market. And so I think this is something which is going to be the case with many of the other things that you're talking about, like upskilling your workforce, investing in reducing your carbon footprint. Those are things which will take a very long time to pay off. And so what does then that mean for running these companies? I think if you're on the board of directors, so to re-ask the question you asked me about BP, how would I think of this if I was on the compensation committee? When we often think about paying CEOs, always the focus seems to be on let's pay them a little bit less, right? So that's based on the pie splitting mentality. If I give less to the CEO, there's more to go around. And so certainly, the level should be restrained. But for me, the most important thing is the horizon of your incentive. So if I give the CEO shares that he or she can't sell for 7 or 10 years, then that changes their mindset. And there are some companies where even after the CEO is left, the CEO still has to hold shares in that company for a number of years afterward. And so their mindset is beyond their tenure. So I think when we think about these things being in the long term, then a lot of the trade-offs that we see, they actually attenuated in the long term because cost of some certain investments which are costly in the short term, you will get the payoff later in terms of an upskilled workforce.
And so when it comes to measuring what matters most, how are CEOs and investors, how can they think a little bit more deeply around non-financial metrics? How do they set them? How do they get a sense of, some of the indicators that are going to help them have a better sense of performance in the long term?
I think the key way to think about non-financial metrics is they have to be tailored to a company's specific purpose. So the approach which currently we see is ESG metrics, which have to be comparable and one size fits all. So every company needs to report water usage and carbon emissions and so forth. And I'm not claiming those things are unimportant, yet they are important. But are they the main way in which a company serves society? So when Vodafone, the UK telecoms company, launched M-Pesa, this mobile money service in Kenya, that lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender parity by allowing women to start their own businesses, that did nothing for the carbon footprint. That did nothing for water usage. That didn't even do anything for gender diversity within Vodafone, the organisation. Yet, if you think about how many people it lifted out of poverty and how many people were women, that has a huge impact. So what you need to do is to think about what are the ways in which you're measuring your specific business model and your specific initiative. So to think about these things as key performance indicators. So what is the key performance indicator? That is something relevant for your specific business model. So for Vodafone, it was the number of people you lifted out of poverty. For Unilever, that might be the number of people that they reached through hand washing programs. So they had a mission to reach 1 billion people about the importance of hand washing. For Electronic Arts, this gaming company, this is gender diversity, but not gender diversity in the workforce. This is gender diversity in the customer base. Why? Because they're a gaming company, and gaming companies historically were catering to a very male-dominated profession. This is just good business sense that you don't want to alienate half of your potential customers. And so that was something where in that specific industry, they said, yeah, okay, gender diversity in the workforce matters, but what really matters is this in the customer base. So rather than sort of being a Me Too company who says, let me just report the metrics everybody else is measuring, let's sort of tune out the demands from these reporting frameworks and say, what would we want to track ourselves internally in order to look at the success of our business? And so for some companies, it might be the gender diversity of our customer base. It might be let's reach people with hand washing. Why? Well, on the one hand, that's altruistic. We want to get people to understand the importance of soap to prevent hygiene. But there is a business rationale behind it, because if people understand how soap can prevent illnesses, that will be good for sale of soap. And so to think about it from a business perspective, so whenever you have ESG metrics, which are divorced from the business, then I think they lose credibility within the organization. People think, okay, we're reporting them because we have to, but we're really not going to be caring about it. If you can report an ESG initiative, which is linked to the business, sales of soap, sales of computer games towards females, those things I think have much more credibility within the organization, and they're going to be reported in more than just a box ticking way.
I'm hearing focus and ensure that the metrics are material to the business in the long term. Got it. My final question for you, Alex, is I love asking this question, and I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. So if you had to choose one book or idea that's really informed the path that you've taken in your career, what would it be?
So I love the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, which I'm sure many of your listeners would have heard. It's an absolute bestseller. So it was given to me when I was a teenager, and just like most teenagers, I never read it. So a family friend gave it and I just passed it aside. But then I read it many years later. I wish I'd read it when I was first given it. And so I think a couple of principles that we've talked about have been linked to things in that book. For example, one of its principles is listen with the intent to understand, not the intent to reply. So if you're somebody who believes strongly in ESG and you see this article challenging ESG, we automatically want to be on the defensive and prove them wrong. But let's think, well, can I learn from this? But probably an article is not 100% wrong. Even if I disagree with 90% of it, maybe there's 10% which I learn and I come away smarter and more rounded than I did before. Another of his principles is the importance of focus. So right at the start, he talks about time management. He talks about those things which are important, even if they're not urgent, and how many things can be important. It might only be 2 or 3 at a time. So just like when a company thinks about the ESG metrics, the last thing that we just talked about, Jen, it can't be that we're going to lead the way on water usage and carbon emissions and diversity and particulate pollution, all of those things. Instead, maybe for me as a company which is making soup and soap, like Unilever, let me really focus on educating people on the importance of hand washing. Maybe if I'm a bank like NatWest, I'm going to try to make sure that I'm going to help companies transition towards a greener future, and also help entrepreneurs, particularly minority entrepreneurs, who historically have been shut out of loans, perhaps because of the screening process might be more discriminatory towards them. So let me think about a couple of things and do them really well. My responsibility is not to try to solve all 17 sustainable development goals, but to focus on the 2 or 3 where I can really move the needle.
Alex Edmans, thank you so much for joining us on the Future in Sound podcast.
Thanks so much, Jen. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you to Alex for joining us. You can learn more about his work by checking out the links in the episode description, or by visiting re.co.com/thefutureinsound. The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jen Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a software as a service company helping clients achieve resilient competitive advantage in the long term. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And if you have a moment, rate us in your podcast app. Until next time, thanks for listening.